The morning sun cast long shadows across the small terraced house in Manchester as 72-year-old Robert Thompson sat at his kitchen table, staring at the overdue bills scattered before him. His weathered hands, marked by decades of hard work and service, trembled slightly as he picked up the electricity notice. The red letters seemed to mock him. Final notice payment required within 7 days or supply will be disconnected. Robert's living room was a shrine to a life of service that most people had forgotten. Above the worn sofa hung his framed medals, the Military Cross for Gallantry, the Campaign Service Medal, and several others that caught the light streaming through the dusty windows. Photos of his younger self in crisp military uniform stood alongside images of his late wife, Margaret, who had passed away 3 years earlier after a long battle with cancer. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a man who had risked his life for his country in Northern Ireland during some of the most dangerous years of the Troubles, now struggling to keep his lights on. After Margaret's death, the small pension he received barely covered the rising costs of living. The house that had once been filled with laughter and warmth now felt cold and empty, much like his bank account. Robert's military career had been distinguished, though he rarely spoke about it. He had joined the British Army at 18, driven by a sense of duty instilled by his father, who had served in World War II. His early years were spent in Germany during the Cold War, but it was his deployment to Northern Ireland in the late 1970s and early 1980s that would define his military legacy. The streets of Belfast were a maze of tension and violence where every corner could hide danger. Robert served with the Parachute Regiment, conducting patrols through hostile neighborhoods where snipers and improvised explosive devices were constant threats. His unit was responsible for maintaining order in areas where the local population often viewed them with suspicion and hostility. It was during a routine patrol in West Belfast that Robert's actions would earn him his most significant recognition. Intelligence had indicated that a high-ranking IRA operative was planning a bombing that could kill dozens of civilians. Robert's team was tasked with locating and capturing the suspect, but the operation quickly turned into a deadly ambush. As his unit moved through narrow streets lined with terraced houses, gunfire erupted from multiple directions. Robert's commanding officer was hit immediately, falling to the ground with a serious leg wound. 2 other soldiers were pinned down by sniper fire from a building across the street. In the chaos that followed, Robert made a decision that would haunt and define him for the rest of his life. Without regard for his own safety, Robert sprinted across the exposed street under heavy gunfire to reach his wounded commander. The bullets were so close he could hear them whistling past his ears and striking the pavement around him. He dragged his officer to safety behind a brick wall, applied first aid to stem the bleeding, and then organized a counterattack that would allow his pinned teammates to escape. But Robert wasn't finished. Intelligence suggested that civilians in a nearby apartment building were being held hostage by the same group that had ambushed them. Despite orders to wait for backup, Robert made the decision to enter the building alone. He knew that waiting could mean the difference between life and death for innocent people. The building was dark and filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder. Robert moved carefully through each floor, checking rooms and listening for any signs of the hostages. On the 3rd floor, he found them, a family of 4, including 2 young children, tied up in a cramped bedroom while armed men planned their next move in the adjacent room. What followed was a tense standoff that lasted nearly 2 hours. Robert positioned himself strategically, using his training and experience to outmaneuver the hostage-takers. Through a combination of tactical skill and sheer determination, he was able to neutralize the threat and safely evacuate the family. The children, a boy of 8 and a girl of 6, clung to him as he carried them to safety. The operation was a success, but it came at a personal cost. Robert had sustained injuries during the firefight, including shrapnel wounds to his shoulder and leg. More significantly, the psychological impact of what he had witnessed and done would stay with him for decades. The faces of the children he had saved became a source of comfort during his darkest moments, but the memories of the violence and chaos never truly faded. For his actions that day, Robert was awarded the Military Cross, one of the highest decorations for gallantry that can be awarded to members of the British Armed Forces. The citation praised his exceptional courage and selfless devotion to duty, and noted that his actions had undoubtedly saved multiple civilian lives. The medal ceremony was attended by high-ranking military officials, and Robert's photo appeared in several newspapers. But recognition in the military and recognition in civilian life proved to be very different things. After completing his service, Robert returned to Manchester, where he had grown up. The transition from military to civilian life was more difficult than he had anticipated. The skills that had made him an exceptional soldier didn't easily translate to the job market of the 1990s. He found work in construction, using his hands and his strong work ethic to make an honest living. It was hard physical labor, but Robert never complained. He had learned discipline and perseverance in the army, and he applied those same qualities to his civilian career. The pay wasn't great, but it was enough to support himself and Margaret, whom he had married shortly after leaving the military. Margaret understood Robert in ways that others couldn't. She saw past the quiet exterior to the man who sometimes woke up in cold sweats, reliving moments from his service. She never pushed him to talk about his experiences, but she was always there when he needed her. Their marriage became his anchor, the thing that kept him grounded and gave his life meaning beyond the memories of war. The years passed quietly. Robert worked steadily, saved what he could, and enjoyed simple pleasures, Sunday dinners with Margaret, watching football matches, and tending to the small garden behind their house. He rarely spoke about his military service, even to close friends. When people learned about his background, they were often surprised. The soft-spoken man who fixed their roof or helped with home renovations didn't fit their image of a decorated war hero. This humility, which had served him well in the military, became a disadvantage in civilian life. Robert never sought attention or special treatment. He didn't join veteran organizations or attend military reunions. He simply wanted to live a quiet life with his wife, contributing to his community in small but meaningful ways. As the years turned into decades, Robert's body began to show the effects of his hard life. The injuries he had sustained during his military service, combined with the physical demands of construction work, led to chronic pain and reduced mobility. He was forced to retire earlier than he had planned, living on a modest military pension that had been calculated based on his years of service and rank. When Margaret became ill with cancer, their financial situation became increasingly precarious. The cost of her treatment, combined with the reduced income from Robert's early retirement, strained their resources. Robert cared for his wife with the same dedication he had shown to his military duties, never leaving her side during her final months. After Margaret's death, the house that had been their sanctuary became a daily reminder of his loss. The silence was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece and the occasional sound of neighbors going about their lives. Robert's world had shrunk to the confines of his small home, where he spent his days reading old books and looking through photo albums filled with memories of better times. The bills continued to arrive with relentless regularity, each one a reminder of his increasingly desperate financial situation. The heating had been turned off months ago to save money. Robert wore multiple layers of clothing indoors and went to bed early to avoid the cold. He had sold most of Margaret's jewelry and some of his own possessions to make ends meet, but it wasn't enough. The local council had offered assistance, but the bureaucratic maze of applications and assessments felt overwhelming to a man who had once navigated much more complex situations with ease. Pride also played a role in his reluctance to seek help. Robert had spent his entire life being self-sufficient, and the idea of depending on handouts felt foreign to him. His neighbors, most of whom were decades younger, barely acknowledged his existence. To them, he was simply the old man next door, someone to be politely ignored. They had no idea that the quiet gentleman who struggled to carry his groceries up the front steps was a decorated war hero who had once risked everything to save the lives of strangers. The local shops treated him with the casual indifference reserved for elderly customers. When he counted out coins to pay for his meager groceries, he could sense the impatience of younger shoppers waiting behind him. The world seemed to move at a pace that had left him behind, and his contributions to society felt like ancient history. Robert's isolation was complete. He had no children, few remaining friends, and no family members who stayed in regular contact. The military community that had once been his brotherhood felt distant and disconnected from his current reality. He existed in a strange limbo between his past achievements and his present struggles, honored in theory but invisible in practice. On particularly difficult days, Robert would take out his medals and hold them in his hands, remembering the weight of responsibility he had once carried and the lives he had touched. The military cross seemed especially significant, not because of the recognition it represented, but because of the children whose faces he could still see clearly after all these years. He wondered what had become of them, whether they had grown up to have families of their own, whether they ever thought about the soldier who had carried them to safety. The irony of his situation wasn't lost on him. Society spoke often about supporting veterans and honoring those who had served, but the reality for many older servicemen and women was very different. The parades and ceremonies were wonderful gestures, but they didn't help with the daily struggle of making ends meet on a small pension in an increasingly expensive world. Robert's health was also deteriorating. The chronic pain from his old injuries was getting worse, but medical appointments were expensive, and the wait times for treatment through the National Health Service were long. He had learned to manage his discomfort with over-the-counter medications and sheer willpower, the same way he had managed everything else in his life. Despite his circumstances, Robert maintained his dignity and his routine. He still shaved every morning, still made his bed with military precision, and still polished his shoes even though he rarely left the house. These small acts of self-respect were his way of maintaining connection to the man he had once been, the soldier who had stood tall in the face of danger. The local community center occasionally reached out to elderly residents, but Robert politely declined their invitations to social events. He wasn't being antisocial. He simply felt disconnected from people who couldn't understand his experiences. The gap between his past life of purpose and meaning and his current existence felt too vast to bridge through casual conversation over tea and biscuits. As winter approached, Robert faced the very real possibility that he might have to choose between heating his home and eating regular meals. The electricity company had been patient, but their patience had limits. The thought of sitting in a cold, dark house for months filled him with a despair deeper than any he had experienced, even during the worst moments of his military service. The medals on his wall seemed to watch over him like silent sentinels, reminders of a time when his actions mattered, when his courage made a difference in the world. Now, his daily acts of courage were much smaller but no less significant, getting out of bed each morning, maintaining his dignity in the face of poverty, and holding on to hope that somehow things might get better. Robert Thompson, Military Cross recipient and forgotten hero, prepared for what might be the most challenging battle of his life, the fight for basic dignity and survival in a society that had moved on without him. Little did he know that his story was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would remind the world that true heroism never really disappears. It simply waits for the right moment to shine again. The morning of November 15th started like any other for Robert Thompson. He woke before dawn, a habit ingrained from decades of military life, and moved slowly through his morning routine. The house was bitterly cold, and his breath was visible as he shuffled to the kitchen in his worn slippers and dressing gown. The electricity had been disconnected 3 days earlier, just as the power company had threatened, leaving him without heating, lighting, or even the ability to boil water for tea. Robert's neighbor, Mrs. Sarah Chen, had noticed something was wrong when she realized there were no lights coming from his house during the evening hours. Sarah was a journalist for the Manchester Evening News, a woman in her 30s who had moved to the neighborhood 2 years earlier. Unlike many of Robert's neighbors, she had always been polite when they encountered each other, offering a friendly wave or a brief conversation about the weather. Sarah's journalistic instincts had been triggered by Robert's darkened house. She had observed him over the years, noting his military bearing and the way he carried himself despite his obvious struggles. There was something about the old man that suggested he had stories to tell, experiences that might be worth exploring. When she saw him counting coins at the local shop, carefully selecting only the cheapest items, her suspicions were confirmed that he was facing serious financial difficulties. On the morning of the 15th, Sarah noticed Robert leaving his house carrying what appeared to be a small bag of belongings. His movements were different from usual. There was a sense of purpose mixed with resignation that caught her attention. She watched from her kitchen window as he walked slowly down the street, pausing occasionally to rest his weight against garden walls or bus stops. Sarah made a decision that would change both of their lives. She grabbed her coat and followed Robert at a distance, curious about where he might be going with what looked like his few remaining possessions. The November morning was gray and drizzly, typical Manchester weather that seemed to match the somber mood of Robert's journey. Robert's destination surprised her. He walked for nearly an hour, stopping frequently to catch his breath, until he reached the Manchester War Memorial in St. Peter's Square. The memorial, A stone cenotaph surrounded by remembrance wreaths and poppies stood in stark contrast to the modern buildings that had grown up around it. Robert approached the memorial slowly, his bag clutched in his weathered hands. What Sarah witnessed next would stay with her for the rest of her career. Robert carefully opened his bag and removed his military medals, each one wrapped in tissue paper. With the reverence of a man performing a sacred ritual, he laid them at the base of the memorial. His military cross caught what little sunlight filtered through the gray clouds, the ribbon still pristine after all these years. Sarah watched from a distance as Robert knelt beside his medals, his lips moving in what appeared to be a silent prayer or conversation with fallen comrades. The scene was both heartbreaking and profoundly moving. Here was a man who had given so much to his country that he was literally giving back the symbols of that service because he no longer had anything else of value. After several minutes, Robert stood slowly, his knees protesting the movement. He looked around the square as if seeing it for the last time, then began walking toward the nearby homeless shelter. Sarah realized with horror that this proud military veteran was preparing to surrender his independence and dignity because he had no other options left. She couldn't let this happen without at least trying to help. Sarah approached Robert carefully, not wanting to startle or embarrass him. When she called his name softly, he turned with the alertness of someone who had spent years in dangerous situations. His eyes, though tired, still held the sharp intelligence that had served him well during his military career. "Mr. Thompson," Sarah said gently, "I'm Sarah Chen, your neighbor from Marlborough Street. I couldn't help but notice you seemed troubled this morning. Is everything all right?" Robert's first instinct was to deflect, to maintain his privacy and dignity even in this desperate moment. But something in Sarah's tone, perhaps the genuine concern in her voice, broke through his defenses. For the first time in years, he found himself actually talking to someone about his situation. The conversation that followed was awkward at first. Robert was not used to discussing his problems, and Sarah was careful not to seem intrusive or condescending. But gradually, the full scope of Robert's circumstances became clear. The disconnected utilities, the dwindling savings, the choice between food and heating, and ultimately, the decision to surrender his independence rather than freeze to death in his own home. When Robert mentioned his military service almost casually, Sarah's journalistic instincts sharpened. She gently probed for more details, and slowly, the extraordinary story of Robert's heroism began to emerge. He spoke reluctantly about Northern Ireland, about the children he had saved, about the medal that now lay at the base of the war memorial. Sarah was stunned. The quiet man she had occasionally exchanged pleasantries with was not just a veteran but a decorated war hero whose actions had saved multiple lives. The disconnect between his heroic past and his current desperate circumstances was almost too stark to believe. Here was a man who had risked everything for strangers, now facing homelessness because society had forgotten his contributions. She convinced Robert to retrieve his medals, promising that she would help him explore other options before he took such a drastic step. Robert was hesitant, uncomfortable with the attention, but Sarah's persistence and genuine concern eventually persuaded him. They returned to the memorial together, where Robert carefully collected his decorations, wrapping them again in their protective tissue paper. Back at Sarah's house, she made tea and encouraged Robert to tell his story properly. What emerged was a tale of extraordinary courage and sacrifice, told with the characteristic understatement of his generation. Robert spoke of his actions in Northern Ireland not as heroism, but simply as doing his job, following his training, and protecting innocent people. Sarah realized she was sitting across from a man whose story needed to be told, not just for his sake, but as a representation of how society was failing its veterans. She asked Robert if he would be willing to be interviewed for a newspaper article, explaining that public awareness might lead to assistance and support. Robert was deeply uncomfortable with the idea of publicity, but Sarah's passion and conviction gradually wore down his resistance. The interview process took several hours, with Robert providing details he had never shared with anyone except Margaret. Sarah was a skilled journalist, and she knew how to draw out information while respecting Robert's dignity and privacy. She focused not just on his military heroics, but on his life since leaving the service, the challenges he had faced, and the systematic failure of support systems that had left him in such desperate circumstances. Sarah's investigation revealed a broader pattern of neglect affecting older veterans. Robert's situation was not unique. Across the country, Men and women who had served with distinction were struggling with poverty, isolation, and inadequate support. The very people who had sacrificed for their country were being abandoned by the system they had defended. Within 48 hours, Sarah had crafted an article that would capture the attention of readers across Britain. She titled it, "The Hero Next Door: How Britain Forgot Its War Heroes," and structured it around Robert's story while highlighting the broader issues facing veterans. The article detailed Robert's military service, his current circumstances, and the stark contrast between society's rhetoric about supporting veterans and the reality of their daily lives. But before publishing the piece, Sarah made several phone calls to veteran support organizations, hoping to generate immediate assistance for Robert. She contacted the Royal British Legion, Help for Heroes, and several other charities, explaining Robert's situation and asking for urgent intervention. The response was immediate and overwhelming. These organizations had resources and programs available, but they relied on veterans or their families to reach out for help. Robert's pride and isolation had prevented him from accessing support that was already there waiting for him. Within hours of Sarah's calls, representatives from multiple veteran support organizations were at Robert's door. They assessed his immediate needs and began implementing solutions. The Royal British Legion arranged for his utilities to be reconnected and his outstanding bills to be paid. Help for Heroes provided emergency financial assistance to cover food and basic necessities. A local veteran support group arranged for regular check-ins and social connections with other former servicemen. But the help went beyond immediate financial assistance. These organizations understood the importance of dignity and independence for veterans like Robert. Rather than simply providing handouts, they worked with him to establish sustainable support systems. They helped him navigate the complex bureaucracy of pension top-ups and disability benefits that he was entitled to but had never claimed. They connected him with medical care for his service-related injuries and ongoing health issues. Most importantly, they helped Robert understand that accepting help was not a sign of weakness or failure. The same courage that had driven him to save lives in Northern Ireland could be channeled into rebuilding his own life. The veteran community that he thought he had lost forever was still there, ready to embrace him as a brother in arms. The transformation in Robert's circumstances was remarkable, but the change in his spirits was even more significant. For the first time in years, he had reason to hope, people to talk to, and a sense that his life still had value and meaning. The isolation that had nearly destroyed him was replaced by connection and community. Sarah's article was scheduled to run in the Manchester Evening News, but word of the story had already begun to spread through social media and journalist networks. The image of a decorated war hero nearly surrendering his medals because he couldn't afford to heat his home was powerful and resonating with people across the country. Robert found himself at the center of attention he had never sought and wasn't entirely comfortable with. But he began to understand that his story was bigger than just his own circumstances. His willingness to share his experiences might help other veterans who were struggling in silence, afraid or too proud to ask for help. The veteran support organizations that had rallied to Robert's aid were also learning from his situation. They realized that their outreach efforts needed to be more proactive, that there were likely hundreds or thousands of veterans like Robert who were struggling invisibly, unaware of available support or too proud to seek it. Sarah's investigation had uncovered systematic gaps in the support network for veterans. While there were numerous organizations dedicated to helping former servicemen and women, coordination between these groups was often poor, and many veterans fell through the cracks. Robert's case became a catalyst for these organizations to work together more effectively and to develop better strategies for reaching isolated veterans. The response from the public was immediate and heartwarming. Even before the full article was published, word of Robert's story had spread through social networks and community groups. People were offering donations, volunteering their time, and sharing stories of other veterans they knew who might need help. Robert's small terraced house, which had been cold and dark just days before, was now warm and well-lit. More importantly, it was no longer the lonely fortress it had become after Margaret's death. Volunteers stopped by regularly to check on him. Fellow veterans invited him to social gatherings, and Sarah had become not just a neighbor but a genuine friend who made sure he was connected to his new support network. But this was just the beginning. Sarah's article was about to reach a much wider audience, and Robert's story would soon capture the attention of people he could never have imagined. The quiet hero who had been treated like a nobody was about to discover that his service to his country had not been forgotten after all, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons and tactics, but with compassion and community. Sarah Chen's article hit the Manchester Evening News website at exactly 6:00 a.m. on a cold Thursday morning in late November. Within 2 hours, it had been shared over 1,000 times on social media. By midday, national news organizations were calling Sarah's editor, asking for permission to run the story. The image of Robert Thompson, Military Cross recipient, nearly surrendering his medals because he couldn't afford heating bills, had struck a nerve across Britain. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Sarah's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the story went live. Television producers, radio hosts, and journalists from major newspapers wanted to interview Robert. The elderly veteran who had lived in virtual anonymity for years suddenly found himself at the center of a media storm that made him deeply uncomfortable. Robert sat in his newly warmed living room, watching the snow fall outside his window while fielding phone call after phone call. Representatives from the BBC, ITV, Sky News, and Channel 4 all wanted to tell his story. The Guardian, The Times, The Daily Telegraph, and The Sun had all requested interviews. The attention was overwhelming for a man who had spent decades avoiding the spotlight. "I don't understand why people are so interested," Robert told Sarah when she stopped by to check on him. "There are thousands of veterans who served with honor. I just did what any soldier would do." Sarah smiled at his characteristic humility. "That's exactly why people are interested, Mr. Thompson. Your story represents something bigger. It's about how we treat the people who serve our country and how easily we forget about them when the cameras stop rolling." The media interest was just the beginning. Within 48 hours of the article's publication, donations began pouring in from across the country. A crowdfunding page that Sarah had reluctantly set up at the urging of veteran organizations raised over £50,000 in its first week. People from all walks of life were contributing, from schoolchildren sending their pocket money to wealthy businessmen writing substantial checks. The donations came with heartfelt messages that moved Robert to tears. A teacher from Liverpool wrote, "My grandfather served in World War II and struggled in his later years. Thank you for your service, and I'm sorry it took so long for people to notice." A group of teenagers from a secondary school in Birmingham collected money from their lunch money, writing, "You saved children like us. Now let us help you." But it wasn't just money that people were offering. Veterans from across the country began reaching out, sharing their own stories and offering friendship and support. Former servicemen who had served in Northern Ireland during the same period as Robert made contact, wanting to reconnect with someone who understood their experiences. The isolation that had defined Robert's recent years was being replaced by a community he thought he had lost forever. The Royal British Legion, which had initially responded to Sarah's calls for help, found itself overwhelmed by inquiries from people wanting to help Robert and other veterans in similar situations. The organization's regional director, Colonel James Hartwell, a Falklands War veteran himself, personally visited Robert to ensure he was receiving proper support. "Your story has reminded people why we exist," Colonel Hartwell told Robert during their meeting. "But more importantly, it's shown us that we need to do better at finding people like you before they reach crisis point. You've given us a wake-up call that could help thousands of other veterans." The attention also brought unexpected reconnections from Robert's past. Former comrades who had lost touch over the decades saw his story in the news and reached out. Messages arrived from men he had served with in Germany and Northern Ireland, including several who had been with him during the operation that earned him his military cross. One particularly emotional contact came from Sean Murphy, one of the soldiers Robert had helped rescue during that firefight in Belfast. Sean had immigrated to Australia decades earlier and had been following Robert's story through international news coverage. His phone call to Robert was filled with emotion and gratitude. "You saved my life that day," Sean told Robert, his voice thick with emotion despite the poor international connection. "I've thought about you countless times over the years, wondering what happened to you. My children know about you, about what you did. You're a hero to my family and always will be." Even more surprising was contact from the family Robert had rescued from the Belfast apartment building. The children, now adults with families of their own, had seen Robert's story and remembered the soldier who had carried them to safety. The boy, now a successful engineer named Patrick, and his sister Mary, a teacher, Both wrote letters expressing their gratitude and their shock at learning about Robert's recent struggles. "You gave us our lives," Patrick wrote. "Everything I've achieved, every moment of happiness I've experienced, exists because of your courage that day. The fact that you've been struggling while we've been living full lives because of your sacrifice is something that will stay with us forever. Please know that you will always be part of our family." The emotional impact of these reconnections was profound for Robert. For years, he had wondered whether his actions in Northern Ireland had made any real difference, whether the people he had helped even remembered what had happened. To learn that not only did they remember, but that they had built successful lives partly because of his intervention gave new meaning to everything he had endured. The story continued to gain momentum when several celebrities began sharing it on their social media platforms. A popular television presenter who had lost her grandfather, a World War II veteran, in poverty and isolation, made an emotional video about Robert's situation that was viewed millions of times. Her message was simple but powerful. "We cannot let this happen to the people who protected us." Major veteran charities across the country reported significant increases in donations and volunteer applications following Robert's story. Help for Heroes saw a 300% increase in online donations in the week following the article's publication. The Royal British Legion experienced similar surges in support, with many donors specifically mentioning Robert's story as their motivation for giving. But the media attention also brought scrutiny of government policies regarding veteran support. Politicians from all parties found themselves being asked difficult questions about how someone with Robert's distinguished service record could end up in such desperate circumstances. The disconnect between political rhetoric about supporting veterans and the reality of inadequate pension systems became a national talking point. Labour MP Sarah Williams raised Robert's case during Prime Minister's questions, asking what the government planned to do to ensure that no other veterans faced similar situations. The Prime Minister promised a review of veteran support services, but critics argued that reviews had been promised before without significant changes being implemented. The story had also caught the attention of military leadership. General Sir Richard Davidson, Chief of the General Staff, issued a public statement expressing the Army's commitment to supporting all veterans and announcing new initiatives to maintain contact with former servicemen throughout their lives. The statement specifically mentioned Robert's case as a reminder that our duty to those who serve does not end when they hang up their uniform. Local community response in Manchester was equally significant. Robert's neighbors, many of whom had barely acknowledged him before, now stopped to chat when they saw him on the street. The local shop owner, who had watched Robert count coins for purchases, quietly arranged to provide free groceries and refused to accept payment for items Robert had previously struggled to afford. The Manchester City Council offered to relocate Robert to better housing, but he politely declined, preferring to stay in the home he had shared with Margaret. Instead, the council arranged for improvements to his existing property, including better insulation and heating systems, ensuring that he would never again face the choice between warmth and food. Schools in the area began inviting Robert to speak to students about his service and experiences. Initially reluctant, Robert eventually agreed to visit a local primary school where children presented him with handmade thank you cards and asked innocent but profound questions about his time in the Army. The experience reminded him of the children he had saved in Belfast and gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. The veteran support network that had emerged around Robert was also working to identify other former servicemen and women in similar situations. Sarah's investigation had revealed that Robert's experience was far from unique, and organizations were now actively searching for isolated veterans who might be struggling in silence. A new initiative called No Veteran Left Behind was launched specifically in response to Robert's story. The program combined the resources of multiple veteran charities to create a comprehensive support network that would proactively reach out to older veterans, ensuring they had access to benefits, healthcare, and social connections. Robert found himself reluctantly becoming the face of this broader movement. Speaking requests continued to pour in from veteran organizations, community groups, and even military units wanting to honor him and learn from his experiences. While the attention remained uncomfortable for him, he began to understand the importance of his role in highlighting these issues. "I never wanted to be famous," Robert told Sarah during one of their regular conversations. But if talking about what happened to me can help other veterans avoid the same situation, then I suppose it's worth it. Margaret always said that our experiences only have meaning if we use them to help others. The transformation in Robert's life was remarkable, but he remained grounded by his fundamental humility and sense of duty. The medals that had nearly been surrendered at the war memorial were now displayed prominently in his living room, not as symbols of personal glory, but as reminders of service and sacrifice. Visitors often commented on the military cross, and Robert would quietly tell them about the real heroes, the children who had survived, the soldiers who had served alongside him, and the family members who had supported veterans through decades of struggle. As winter deepened, Robert's house remained warm and welcoming. The bills that had once seemed insurmountable were now manageable thanks to improved financial support and the generous donations from the public. More importantly, the isolation that had nearly destroyed him was gone, replaced by a rich network of relationships and support systems. But even as Robert's personal situation improved dramatically, the broader issues his story had highlighted remained. Across Britain, thousands of veterans still struggled with poverty, isolation, and inadequate support. Robert's story had brought attention to these problems, but solving them would require sustained effort and systematic changes that went far beyond individual acts of charity. The media attention showed no signs of diminishing. International news organizations had picked up the story, and Robert found himself receiving messages of support from veterans and supporters around the world. His story had become a symbol of both the failure to properly support veterans and the power of community action to make a difference. As Christmas approached, Robert reflected on the extraordinary changes in his life. Less than 2 months earlier, he had been preparing to surrender his independence and live in a homeless shelter. Now, he was warm, financially secure, surrounded by friends and supporters, and playing an important role in improving conditions for other veterans. The man who had once been treated like a nobody had discovered that he had never been forgotten after all. His service, his sacrifice, and his story mattered to more people than he could have ever imagined. But the most remarkable transformation was yet to come, as Robert's story would soon reach the very highest levels of British society and touch the heart of someone who would ensure that his contributions would never be forgotten. The call came on a Tuesday morning in December, just as Robert was finishing his breakfast and reading through the latest batch of letters from supporters around the country. Sarah had stopped by, as she did most mornings now, to check on him and share updates about the continuing response to his story. When Robert's phone rang, he expected it to be another journalist or well-wisher, as had become routine over the past month. Instead, the voice on the other end was crisp, professional, and unmistakably official. "Mr. Thompson, this is Squadron Leader James Morrison from the Royal Household. His Majesty King Charles III has requested a meeting with you, sir. Would you be available to visit Clarence House next week?" Robert nearly dropped the phone. In his 72 years, through military service and civilian life, he had never imagined that the King of England would want to meet with him personally. Sarah, who had been listening to the one-sided conversation with growing excitement, had to steady him as he processed what he had just been told. "I'm sorry," Robert said into the phone. "Could you repeat that, please? I want to make sure I understood correctly." Squadron Leader Morrison patiently repeated the invitation, explaining that His Majesty had been following Robert's story through news reports and had specifically requested to meet with him. The king wanted to personally thank Robert for his service and discuss his experiences as a veteran. The meeting would take place at Clarence House in London, with all travel arrangements provided by the royal household. After Robert hung up, he and Sarah sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The idea that his story had reached the attention of the king seemed surreal. Robert had always respected the monarchy as an institution, but he had never expected any personal interaction with the royal family. "This is incredible," Sarah said, her excitement evident. "The king wants to meet you personally. Do you understand how significant this is?" Robert was characteristically modest in his response. "I suppose he meets with lots of veterans. It's probably just part of his duties." But privately, he was deeply moved by the gesture. To know that someone at the highest level of British society had taken notice of his story and cared enough to arrange a personal meeting was overwhelming. The news of the royal invitation quickly spread through the veteran community and media circles. Colonel Hartwell from the Royal British Legion called to offer assistance with preparation for the meeting, explaining that such personal invitations from the king were extremely rare and significant. The last time King Charles had personally requested to meet with a veteran outside of formal ceremonies had been over a year earlier. Robert spent the days leading up to the meeting in a state of nervous anticipation. He had met high-ranking military officers during his service, but the prospect of meeting the king felt entirely different. Sarah helped him prepare by researching royal protocol and etiquette, though she assured him that King Charles was known for his informal and genuine approach to such meetings. The morning of the meeting, Robert dressed in his best suit, the same one he had worn to Margaret's funeral. He polished his shoes until they gleamed and carefully pinned his military cross and other medals to his jacket. Looking in the mirror, he saw not the struggling elderly man who had nearly surrendered these medals just months earlier, but the proud soldier he had always been underneath. The journey to London was Robert's first time on a train in over a decade. The royal household had arranged first-class travel, and Robert found himself marveling at the English countryside passing by his window. Sarah had wanted to accompany him, but Robert felt this was something he needed to do alone. This meeting was about his service, his sacrifice, and his story. It felt right to face it with the same independence he had shown throughout his military career. Clarence House, the official residence of King Charles III, was more impressive than Robert had imagined. The Georgian mansion stood elegant and imposing in the heart of London, surrounded by carefully manicured gardens despite the December weather. As Robert approached the entrance, he felt the same mixture of nervousness and determination he had experienced before difficult military operations. He was greeted by Squadron Leader Morrison, who had arranged the meeting, and escorted through corridors lined with portraits and artifacts that told the story of British history. The atmosphere was formal yet welcoming, with staff members offering warm smiles and courteous greetings as they passed. Robert was shown into a comfortable sitting room decorated with military memorabilia and photographs of the king, with various service members from different eras. The room felt more like a gentleman's study than a formal royal reception area, which helped ease Robert's nervousness somewhat. When King Charles entered the room, Robert stood immediately and offered a respectful bow. But the king quickly put him at ease, approaching with a warm smile and an extended hand. "Mr. Thompson, thank you for coming. Please sit down. I've been very much looking forward to meeting you." The king's manner was genuine and relaxed, far removed from the formal pomp that Robert had expected. They sat across from each other in comfortable armchairs, and King Charles immediately began asking about Robert's experiences, showing detailed knowledge of his military service and recent circumstances. "I've read about your service in Northern Ireland," the king said. "The operation that earned you the Military Cross was truly extraordinary. Saving those civilians, especially the children, under such dangerous circumstances, that takes remarkable courage." Robert was surprised by the king's specific knowledge of his military record. "Your Majesty has been briefed very thoroughly. I was just doing my job, following my training. Any soldier would have done the same." King Charles smiled at Robert's characteristic modesty. "I've met many soldiers over the years, Mr. Thompson, and I can assure you that not every soldier would have made the choices you made that day. The family you saved, I understand they've been in contact with you recently." The conversation continued for over an hour, with King Charles showing genuine interest in every aspect of Robert's story. They discussed his military service, his struggles after Margaret's death, and the community response to his situation. The king listened intently, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own perspectives on veteran support and the obligations society owes to those who serve. "What troubles me most about your story," King Charles said at one point, "is not just that you faced such difficulties, but that you faced them alone for so long. We have failing systems if decorated veterans can slip through the cracks so completely." Robert found himself speaking more openly than he had with anyone except Sarah about his experiences. There was something about the king's manner that encouraged honesty and reflection. They discussed the isolation that many veterans face, the challenges of transitioning from military to civilian life, and the disconnect between public support for the military and practical support for individual veterans. King Charles shared his own experiences meeting with veterans over the years and his observations about the challenges they face. As the Prince of Wales and now as king, he had made veteran support one of his key areas of focus. but Robert's story had highlighted gaps in the system that needed to be addressed more urgently. "Your story has had a remarkable impact," the king told Robert. "The response from the public has been extraordinary, but more importantly, it's forced us all to examine how we can do better. Organizations are changing their approaches, government policies are being reviewed, and individual lives are being touched by your example." As their conversation drew to a close, King Charles made an announcement that left Robert speechless. "Mr. Thompson, I would like to invite you to attend the New Year Honors Ceremony. While your military cross was well-deserved recognition for a specific act of courage, I believe your broader service and the way you've handled recent challenges deserve additional recognition." Robert was too overwhelmed to respond immediately. The idea of additional honors seemed unnecessary to him, but he understood the significance of the gesture. This was the king's way of ensuring that Robert's service would be formally and permanently recognized at the highest levels of British society. "Furthermore," King Charles continued, "I'm establishing a new initiative for veteran support, and I'd like you to be involved as an advisor. Your experiences, both your military service and your recent struggles, give you insights that could help us prevent other veterans from facing similar situations." The meeting concluded with King Charles personally walking Robert to the entrance of Clarence House, an honor that was not lost on the veteran. As they shook hands goodbye, the king's final words stayed with Robert long after he had returned home to Manchester. "Remember, Mr. Thompson, that your service to your country didn't end when you left the army. The courage you've shown in sharing your story and helping others is just as important as anything you did in uniform. Thank you for your continued service." The train journey back to Manchester gave Robert time to process what had happened. The meeting had been everything he could have hoped for and more. The king had been genuinely interested in his story, knowledgeable about his service, and committed to using Robert's experiences to help other veterans. Most importantly, Robert felt heard and valued in a way he hadn't experienced in years. When he arrived home, Sarah was waiting with a bottle of champagne and a house full of neighbors and veteran friends who wanted to hear about his royal encounter. Robert found himself becoming quite the storyteller, recounting his conversation with King Charles and the warm reception he had received. The news of Robert's meeting with the king made headlines across the country. The image of the decorated veteran who had nearly been forgotten by society being personally recognized by the monarch resonated powerfully with the public. It represented both the importance of individual recognition and the broader commitment to veteran support. Over the following days, Robert received hundreds of additional letters and messages congratulating him on the royal meeting. Fellow veterans expressed pride that one of their own had been so honored, while supporters of his story saw the king's involvement as validation of their concerns about veteran welfare. The announcement of Robert's involvement in the king's new veteran support initiative generated significant interest from military and civilian organizations. His unique perspective, as both a decorated war hero and someone who had experienced the failures of the support system, made him an ideal advisor for developing more effective programs. Robert threw himself into this new role with the same dedication he had shown to everything else in his life. He began working with veteran organizations, government departments, and charitable foundations to identify gaps in current support systems and develop solutions. His experiences provided insights that academic studies and official reports had missed. The initiative gained momentum quickly, with major veteran charities collaborating on joint programs and government departments streamlining their processes for providing support. Robert's story had become a catalyst for systematic change that would benefit thousands of veterans across the country. As Christmas approached, Robert reflected on the extraordinary year he had experienced. He had gone from near homelessness to meeting the King of England, from isolation to being surrounded by a supportive community, from feeling forgotten to playing a key role in improving veteran welfare. But perhaps most importantly, he had rediscovered his sense of purpose. The same drive to serve others that had motivated his military career was now channeled into helping fellow veterans. His service to his country had not ended with his retirement from the army. It had simply taken a different form. The man who had once been treated like a nobody had not only regained his dignity and security, but had become an important voice for change. And with the king's personal support behind the Veteran Welfare Initiative, Robert knew that his story would continue to make a difference long after the media attention faded. The New Year's honors ceremony at Buckingham Palace was everything Robert had imagined it would be, yet somehow more personal and meaningful than he had expected. As he stood in the grand ballroom among other honorees, wearing his best suit with his military medals proudly displayed, Robert marveled at the journey that had brought him to this moment. Just over a year ago, he had been preparing to surrender these very medals because he couldn't afford to keep his house warm. King Charles personally presented Robert with his Officer of the Order of the British Empire, OBE medal, awarded for his distinguished military service and his contributions to veteran welfare. As the king placed the medal around Robert's neck, he whispered, "This recognition is long overdue, Mr. Thompson. Thank you for everything you've done and continue to do." The citation read aloud during the ceremony highlighted not only Robert's heroic actions in Northern Ireland, but also his recent work in veteran advocacy. The official description noted his exceptional courage in military service and outstanding commitment to improving the welfare of fellow veterans. For Robert, this recognition represented not just personal honor, but validation that his recent struggles had ultimately served a greater purpose. Sarah Chen, who had been invited to attend the ceremony, watched with tears in her eyes as her neighbor and friend received one of the highest honors the nation could bestow. The quiet man she had followed to the war memorial that gray November morning was now being celebrated at the pinnacle of British society. Her decision to approach him that day had changed both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. Following the ceremony, Robert was invited to a private reception where he met other honorees and their families. Among them was Dr. Patricia Williams, a cancer researcher being honored for her breakthrough treatments, and James Patterson, a teacher who had developed innovative programs for disadvantaged children. Robert found himself in conversations that reminded him that service to others took many different forms, and that his military background was just one way to contribute to society. The most meaningful moment of the day came when Robert was approached by a young soldier in dress uniform. Captain David Mitchell had read about Robert's story and specifically requested to meet him. Captain Mitchell was preparing for deployment to a peacekeeping mission in Eastern Europe and wanted to express his gratitude for Robert's service and the example he had set. "You've shown us that being a soldier doesn't end when you take off the uniform," Captain Mitchell told Robert. "The way you've turned your struggles into something that helps others, that's what real leadership looks like." The conversation reminded Robert of his younger self, full of idealism and commitment to service. He saw in Captain Mitchell the same dedication that had driven his own military career, and he felt a responsibility to ensure that this new generation of soldiers would have better support when their service ended. The months following the honors ceremony saw Robert's role in veteran advocacy continue to expand. The King's Veteran Support Initiative, which had been named the Service Covenant Foundation, was gaining momentum across the country. Robert served as one of its key advisors, working directly with government ministers, military leaders, and charity executives to develop comprehensive support programs. The Foundation's approach was revolutionary in its scope and coordination. Rather than relying on separate organizations working independently, it created an integrated network that could identify and assist struggling veterans before they reached crisis points. Robert's experiences had highlighted the need for proactive outreach rather than reactive assistance. One of the Foundation's most successful programs was the Veteran Neighbor Initiative, inspired directly by Sarah's role in Robert's rescue. The program trained community members to identify signs that veterans might be struggling and connected them with appropriate support services. Within 6 months of its launch, the program had helped over 500 veterans across the United Kingdom access assistance they had previously been unaware of or too proud to seek. Robert's personal story became a cornerstone of the Foundation's awareness campaigns. His willingness to share his experiences openly helped break down the stigma that prevented many veterans from seeking help. The message was clear. Asking for assistance was not a sign of weakness, but a continuation of the courage that had defined their military service. The transformation of Robert's own life continued to amaze those who knew him. His small terraced house in Manchester had become an unofficial headquarters for veteran advocacy in the Northwest. Fellow veterans stopped by regularly, seeking advice or simply wanting to talk to someone who understood their experiences. Robert's kitchen table, where he had once counted coins to pay bills, was now the site of planning sessions for national veteran support programs. Sarah's relationship with Robert had evolved into a deep friendship that enriched both their lives. She had won several journalism awards for her coverage of veteran issues, including the prestigious Press Award for Social Impact Journalism. But more importantly to her, she had found a cause that gave her work deeper meaning and a friend who had taught her about resilience and dignity in the face of adversity. The ripple effects of Robert's story continued to spread throughout British society. Schools across the country invited him to speak to students about service, sacrifice, and the importance of looking after one another. His talks were simple but powerful, focusing on the idea that everyone has the capacity to make a difference in someone else's life. During one particularly memorable school visit, Robert met a young girl named Emily who asked him if he was scared when he saved the children in Belfast. Robert's honest answer, that he was terrified, but did it anyway because it was the right thing to do, sparked a discussion about courage that the children would remember for years to come. The international attention Robert's story had received also led to connections with veteran organizations around the world. He received invitations to speak at conferences in the United States, Canada, and Australia, sharing the British approach to veteran support and learning from other countries' successful programs. These exchanges enriched the Service Covenant Foundation's work and helped establish international best practices for veteran care. Robert's relationship with the family he had saved in Belfast had also deepened over the months. Patrick and Mary, the children he had carried to safety, visited him in Manchester with their own families. Watching their children play in his garden while their parents shared stories of their successful lives, Robert felt a profound sense of completion. The circle of service that had begun with a moment of courage in a Belfast apartment building had led to this. Multiple generations connected by an act of heroism that had rippled through decades. The financial security that had seemed so elusive just a year earlier was now firmly established. The donations from the public, combined with improved veteran benefits and assistance from various organizations, had eliminated Robert's money worries entirely. But more importantly, he had found a new purpose that made each day meaningful. Robert's role as an advisor to the Service Covenant Foundation had evolved into something approaching a full-time job, though he would never have described it that way. He split his time between policy development meetings in London, local veteran outreach in Manchester, and speaking engagements across the country. At 73, he was busier and more engaged than he had been in years. The most significant moment in Robert's advocacy work came when he was invited to address Parliament's Defence Committee about veteran support services. Standing in the House of Commons, the same building where decisions about his military deployment had been made decades earlier, Robert spoke passionately about the disconnect between political rhetoric and practical support for veterans. "We send young men and women into harm's way with the promise that their nation will stand by them," Robert told the assembled MPs. "That promise doesn't end when they complete their service. It's a covenant that lasts a lifetime, and we must do better at honoring it." His testimony was credited with influencing the passage of enhanced veteran welfare legislation that increased support services and streamlined access to benefits. The bill, informally known as Robert's Law in political circles, represented the most significant improvement in veteran support in over a decade. As the second anniversary of Sarah's original article approached, Robert reflected on the extraordinary changes in his life. He had gone from near destitution to financial security, from isolation to being surrounded by friends and supporters, from feeling forgotten to playing a key role in national veteran policy. But perhaps the most important change was internal. Robert had rediscovered his sense of worth and purpose. The depression and despair that had nearly consumed him after Margaret's death had been replaced by energy and engagement. He woke each morning with things to do, people to help, and the knowledge that his life continued to make a difference. The house he shared with Margaret remained his sanctuary, but it was no longer a place of isolation. The rooms that had once echoed with loneliness now buzzed with activity as fellow veterans, foundation staff, journalists, and friends came and went throughout each week. The kitchen where Robert had once sat alone reading overdue bills was now where he planned programs that would help thousands of veterans across the country. On quiet evenings, Robert would often sit in his armchair looking at the medals displayed on his wall. The military cross still held pride of place, but it was now accompanied by his OBE and several awards from veteran organizations. More importantly, the walls were covered with photographs, images from speaking engagements, letters from veterans who had been helped by foundation programs, and pictures of the extended family of supporters who had rallied around his cause. King Charles had kept in regular contact with Robert throughout the year, checking on his progress and the foundation's work. Their relationship had evolved beyond the formal interaction of monarch and subject to something approaching genuine friendship. The king's personal interest in Robert's welfare and the veteran cause had been crucial in maintaining political and public support for the foundation's expanding programs. On a cold December evening, exactly 2 years after Sarah had first approached him at the War Memorial, Robert received a phone call that would cap off his remarkable transformation. The caller was the Secretary of State for Defense, informing him that he had been selected to receive the highest honor the military could bestow upon a veteran: appointment as an honorary colonel of his former regiment. The appointment was recognition not only of his military service, but of his continued contributions to veteran welfare. It would give him a formal role in supporting current soldiers and helping to bridge the gap between active service and veteran life. For Robert, it represented the completion of a circle that had begun with his enlistment as a young man over 5 decades earlier. As he prepared for bed that night, Robert looked around his warm, well-lit home and thought about the journey that had brought him to this point. The medals on his wall caught the lamplight, but they no longer represented only past achievements. They were symbols of ongoing service, reminders that true heroism isn't confined to moments of battlefield courage, but extends to a lifetime of service to others. Robert Thompson, who had once been treated like a nobody, had not only reclaimed his place in society, but had become an inspiration to millions. His story proved that it's never too late for redemption, that communities have the power to transform individual lives, and that sometimes the most important battles are won not with weapons, but with compassion, determination, and the refusal to let good people fall through the cracks. The man who had nearly surrendered his medals in despair now wore them with renewed pride, knowing that his greatest service to his country was still ahead of him. In saving Robert Thompson, society had reminded itself of its obligations to all those who serve, and in the process, had rediscovered the power of collective action and individual dignity. Robert's story had become a testament to the idea that no one who serves their country should ever be forgotten, and that sometimes, when the system fails, ordinary people can come together to create extraordinary change. The decorated hero who had been treated like a nobody had reminded an entire nation of what it means to truly honor those who serve.